Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment. This session is on the repayment of recruitment fees to migrant workers. And I think we'll be taking it sort of in two ways. One is the immediate remedy that the repayment of fees can offer, repayments by suppliers, by brands to the workers or by agencies themselves. And then the second question really is that more strategic one. What does repayment do to upend the existing model of workers paying in the first place? Does it feed the status quo, or is repayment of fees actually a catalyst for change? Now, to help us discuss this, we have three excellent speakers. Rosie Hurst is the founder and director of Impact. Rosie, I'm just reading, we've known each other for a while, but I don't think I've ever read your biography properly. You founded CEDEX. I didn't even know that.
I know.
That's an amazing...
Forgiveness is possible, I hope.
I think in the bio, it also talks about the TEDx talk you've done on this issue. So welcome, Rosie. I know this is an issue you've thought a lot about, and also in the context of Malaysia and Qatar, it's an issue that you've worked on directly. David Pettit. David, hello. You are Global Human Rights and Sustainable Supply Chain Director for Reckitt, a company that used to have a longer, more complex name, but it's now just Reckitt. And people might not have heard of your company, but they will have heard of the brands that your company owns across a whole range of household goods. But maybe you can come on to that when you speak in a minute. And Adrian Pereira. Welcome, Adrian, who's joining us from Malaysia. Adrian is Executive Director of the North-South Initiative, and you work deeply on issues of social justice and human rights within Malaysia, including the issue we're talking about today. So, Adrian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Now, we have time for lots of questions and discussion during this session. So I do encourage all of you who are listening to put questions into the question function as soon as you can. You can start doing that straight away, and we will be looking at those in real time. So I'm hoping that we can bring those questions in, not just at the end, but also in between the speakers speaking as well. We have a translation today in two languages, into Spanish and into Arabic. And this slide here shows you what you need to do to switch from English to those languages. Okay, well, I think we can get started now. So Rosie, why don't you kick us off with your own thinking around the repayment of fees and why it is something we should all be doing? Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Can I have my slides, please? Fantastic. We'll just go straight on to then the first slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so why, and can I just say, John, thank you so much for having this session. It is, I think, excellent that I believe this is the first session that there has ever been at this event on repayment. It's high time, and I'm really glad that you have consecrated this time to the topic. Why? Because if you ask workers, repayment really matters to workers. Repayment of recruitment fees in many cases makes the difference between an extractive and exploitative experience and an experience which actually delivers some of the hopes which workers had when they set out on their journey. So for that reason and that alone, it's extremely important. The second point, which I know is more controversial, is that our evidence shows that repayment sharpens focus on more ethical recruitment in the future. So we find that companies which have repaid, because repayment is expensive and it's difficult, they try harder next time round. So we find reductions of 60 to 70% in the amount of fees reported by workers recruited post-repayment. Not down to zero, but considering that pre-repayment, even in organisations which have adopted zero-cost regimes, workers are still paying high fees, sometimes higher than previously. It seems that repayment has a kind of kick. It has a kind of Heimlich manoeuvre, which means that there's more focus on ethical recruitment in the future. The third reason that we've been working on this area is that there's a yawning gap in the current public standards and tools on repayment. And this means that basically anyone attempting to do this has very little to go on. So each repayment has to be negotiated from scratch, and there is no cross-learning, which is why we have put together a set of standards for this area. And you might say, well, Impact, who are you? You're a small private sector consultancy. You're not a standards body. And you're absolutely right. We put this together, first of all, actually internally to help ourselves, because we have worked over the last 4 or 5 years on 206 separate repayments, which have resulted in more than 100 million going to more than 75,000 workers. It is, in fact, worldwide, which is great, but it's a drop in the ocean. But what we were finding, as I said, was we had to do each one again and again and again. There was nothing to go on. And to be very honest, the success of each repayment, the amount that we were able to negotiate, the scope we were able to negotiate, depended entirely on how much leverage the people on our side had. So if we were working with a customer of a factory that was very, very small, for that particular factory, the success of the repayment was much less. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to systematize this. So the standards are first of all based on lived experience, sweat and tears across Qatar, Singapore and Malaysia. Next slide, please. So having first of all sketched something out on our own experience, we first of all went to technical and legal experts. We had a first small consultation with technical and legal experts, activists, practitioners, just to try and lick them into a little bit more shape. And we found there was a lot of interest, and we made many, many, many changes. After that, we then started consulting much more widely because, of course, it's totally inappropriate that a small consultancy should have these standards. And we were really very, very keen for somebody else to take them on. And we've had a lot of fantastic inputs from the ILO, IOM, trade unions, governments, enforcement agencies, business groups, companies, MSIs, NGOs. In fact, more than 120 stakeholders have now commented. And actually, I'm delighted to announce that the renamed, they're not going to be called standards anymore, they're going to be called principles and guidelines, have just undergone a very strong technical consultation from IOM. Thank you very much, IOM colleagues. People worked incredibly hard there. And we will be reissuing the document next week, including all of the IOM comments, which hopefully I think will strengthen them further. So what we're interested now in doing is continuing the conversation. So that is seeing whether we can get repayment and repayment at a high standard as the norm. Next slide, please. So currently, this document covers who should be included, how to investigate how much people have paid, how to calculate how much should be repaid, over what timeline, what to do with people who've been recruited locally, engagement with workers all the way through, of course, because it is their testimony and their needs which are central to this, verifying it to make sure no one's got sticky fingers, no one's taking the money somewhere in between, and also safeguarding all the way through, because, of course, repayment is one part of remedy, only one small part of remedy. It's a big part, but it's only one small part of remedy, and we must remember that people are very, very vulnerable. So the standards are there, and the new version will be out next week. Let's just talk about the wider context. Next slide, please. My last slide. We're delighted to hear, John. So what needs to happen? Well, I think the first thing that we would love to happen is for this approach to be endorsed, adapted, adopted by the international community. This is a huge problem, and really working with international organisations to make this a reality is super important, and to further consult to make sure that all stakeholder groups feel that what is suggested in these standards, so that's the people from government, people from employers, people from trade unions, are happy that the standards, however they turn out, are fit for purpose. Now, once that's happened, clearly the quality of investigation and verification is super important. There is a risk of a race to the bottom with people wanting to do low quality repayments in order to get off the hook, which is the reason why we think transparency and disclosure are very important. So far, a lot of repayments have taken place in camera under NDA, which means that it's not possible for other parties to say whether they feel that they're good enough. I mean, are they good enough? Do they offer proper remedy? We'd be very, very interested in seeing transparency and disclosure, and possibly even a registry, so that companies which have repaid can disclose this to shareholders, to buyers, and also to regulators. Now, clearly, when you're talking about a large thing like this, you need governance, grievance, and appeals. And that means the involvement of stakeholders to ensure the process is fair. There needs to be agreement of responsibility. And finally, very much to your point, this needs to be engaged with the ongoing development of sustainable recruitment models, so that the segue from repayment to a better tomorrow does not hit the buffers. That was all I was going to say, John. Does that set the scene for you sufficiently?
I think that's really good, Rosie. Thank you. I mean, one quick question. I think, I'm not going to speak for the other panelists, but I think there'll be a lot of agreement around the short term and the long term, right? The short term, the immediate repayment to migrants for fees already paid is a remedy, and I think most of us agree with that. I think we all agree on the long term, which is that the workers shouldn't be paying the fees in the first place, right? So we get to different models of recruitment. It's this medium game of, how long should brand suppliers be repaying fees and tolerating the fact that fees are paid in the first place? And I think, can you give us a sense of this sort of midterm element of this?
Absolutely.
And how you ensure by creating a system of repayment that doesn't become the norm in the long term?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of progress over the last 6 or so months. And one of the things I'm delighted to see is that the standard is being walked up, which means that not only will workers get more under the standard and more in a shorter period of time, but also that the economic shock of repayment will become more intense, which means, because obviously if companies have to repay over a short period of time a large amount of money to a large number of people, it really does concentrate the mind. And certainly we have already seen renewed seriousness in really thinking about how to implement better recruitment in the future. I think just a couple of key points that I haven't covered that need to be incorporated here. One of the key barriers to ethical recruitment in the future is the current financial structure. And I think it's very important to collaborate at a high level with financial institutions in order to be able to come up with something a little like the back-to-back financing, which powers the garment industry, in order to power the recruitment industry, so that recruitment agents have access to the cash they need to do their job and deliver the workers and then be paid. I think that work on financial models for recruitment is utterly essential to making this happen. And without that, technical fixes won't work. Does that help at all?
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I'm sure there'll be questions about that. So I encourage people to start feeding the questions through. David, to you, to give a bit of a business perspective here. I know this is an issue you've been looking at within your own company. So your thoughts on this issue. Thank you.
Well, no, thanks, John. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to share with you what the important stuff we're doing within this space. So as Rosie said, for us, recruitment fee reimbursement is a key part as part of our responsibility to ensure that we respect human rights and enable access to remedy. So before I go in to talk a little about what we've done within this space, let me just set a little bit of context first. So similar to most companies, we have a very clear policy position to respect human rights, and we have a detailed set of standards to ensure that they are followed. We also have a relatively mature program in place to engage with our suppliers to ensure that these standards are met. This is primarily sort of centered around supplier audits, but we've recently shifted a lot of the activity towards capability building, such as supplier workshops, or I would say providing on-site technical support and guidance to suppliers. And in order to support the delivery of these activities, to enable a more, what I would say, collaborative and partnership-orientated approach with our suppliers, we have really invested internally in our own set of regionally based resources in our key markets. And the value that this brings is for us is far greater oversight and confidence of our supplier standards. And it also enables us to be more actively engaged in cases where we find deviations from our policy and the supplier is just unable to sort of address the issues alone. So with this sort of background, a member of my internal team conducted a visit or an audit of one of our key third-party manufacturers within Malaysia at the back end of 2018. Through the audit, there were a number of critical issues identified concerning migrant workers, passport retention being one of them, poor labour accommodation another, and then the third was this issue of recruitment fees and the fact that they had been incurred in some way across the labour corridor. So we initially engaged the supplier around some of these issues, and they were really receptive to change. However, as you can understand, many of these issues have quite significant cost to address, but also they were fairly new to the supplier, particularly the recruitment piece. And consequently, we felt we couldn't necessarily do this alone as we were only one of the customers of this supplier. Fortunately, we knew who the other customer was. So we did reach out to them proactively to sort of flag the issues and explore whether we can together collaborate with the supplier to try to address some of these issues. And they fortunately were. What I would like to say is if they weren't, we really would have had quite a difficult situation in terms of trying to move the needle forward. So our initial focus really was on remediating the most urgent issues. So passport retention was addressed, passports were given back to workers. Labour accommodation, they were moved to a far upgraded, purpose-built labour accommodation. But then this left the sort of more difficult issue around recruitment practices. And we recognized we really needed to do a deep dive to really understand the recruitment practices and the subsequent fees associated with it in order for us to enable effective remedy. So this is where we reached out to Impact. So we reached out to Rosie and the team, as they had quite a lot of experience within this space, particularly at the time for their work they've done in Qatar. And we implemented a sort of, I would say, four-phased approach in terms of how we tackle this issue as a collective. The first was initial investigation. So we really went in and conducted a very worker-centric process of interviewing about 60% of the workforce to really understand what the issues were. And this really confirmed to us that recruitment fees had been paid. They range from about $1,200 for Nepalese workers and went all the way up to around $4,000 for Bangladeshi workers, which again, was not surprising and is something we've seen in other regions as well. What was also clear is that the fees had been incurred within their home country and not within their host country, which in this case was Malaysia. So this was quite interesting. And again, it enabled us to understand where some of these issues were. So once we'd identified what the issues were, the fees that had been paid, we really needed to sit down as a collective, so ourselves, our peer and the supplier, to identify how we move things forward with remedy. And here it's very important, particularly when there are two peers involved, to have the support of an impartial third party to liaise with the stakeholders concerned to define the position. Otherwise, you're sort of straying into deep water when it comes to competition law here. So from a Reckitt perspective, we believed reimbursement was the right approach in order for workers to gain access to remedy in line with the UN guiding principles. But it was also in line with our corporate values of putting people first and doing the right thing always. Fortunately, we all collectively agreed that reimbursement was the way forward. And this is where we really then had to spend the best part of a year through a series of roundtables, offline meetings to really decide and negotiate how we would do this. So what was the scope of the payment? What was the payment timeframes? And this is not easy, particularly when in this case, the supplier was a small supplier, wasn't a big supplier with lots of revenue. And really we're talking about, quite a large amount of recruitment fees that had to be repaid. So really to sort of conclude this, we we had the negotiation process. We defined the 253 workers that were to receive their recruitment fees back. That this amounts to a total of about $800,000 and we are paying it back now on a monthly basis over a slightly longer period of time than we ideally want. Two last remarks, if I may, John. So we've now started the implementation, so payments have commenced. One thing to flag here is around how you then implement it. And it's extremely important that, number one, we effectively communicated to the workers receiving the payments what the payment was for and what the repayment plan was and how they can raise concerns if they had it. Also, it was important to understand the context of the domestic workers, because from their perspective, they were perceiving it as migrant workers, our fellow migrant workers are getting potentially a bit of a bonus here. So there was a whole piece around educating the domestic workers that this isn't a bonus, this is not a pay rise, this is a righting of a wrong. And that's very important to get right. And then the final piece here is about monitoring. We've now implemented. Key is for the period of the repayment plan that we're proactively engaging our supplier and monitoring to ensure that the repayments are being made in line with what we have agreed with them. So this will happen on a quarterly basis. It will include detailed reviews of payment records, supported by worker management interviews, etc. For the first year of the repayment, we have put an additional safeguard in place. So we've put an external grievance line in place, another channel by which workers can raise concerns, while we were also quite keen to start working with the site to develop effective site-level grievance mechanisms so that if that is effective, after the first year, we can move away from the external grievance line and just rely on the site-level grievance mechanisms coupled with the quarterly monitoring process that we have in place.
Thank you.
So,
thanks,
John.
David. Quick question. So you have a supplier in Malaysia, there's you and there's another brand that have that relationship. So who's paying the fees back? Whose money is it?
This is a tricky one, and I can't necessarily go into the detail of it. But yes, it's a blend of all parties concerned.
I thought it might be good. What would have happened if your supplier? So we've got some questions coming through on the feed now. So there's a question here about what you do if a supplier refuses to repay. What would you have done in this case if your supplier had refused to be part of the mix, part of the solution?
Tricky one. Ultimately, our approach with suppliers, be it recruitment fees or any sort of breach of our policies or local law, we engage with them first and foremost. Should they not have been willing to repay, we as a company need to have that discussion internally. I think there's a piece around, would we ourselves be willing to cover the entire cost? We would have to wait and see. But I think that's the first discussion we would have to have internally. If they're the majority customer, then we have a greater responsibility to do so versus if we're a smaller percentage of their business. If ultimately, despite that, they're unwilling, I think the only option is to walk away from a reputational perspective. And I know that doesn't give necessarily access to remedy to the workers concerned, but there is only so much that we can use our leverage on our own or try to increase our leverage in partnership with others. But ultimately, if the supplier refuses, there's very little we can do.
Great, thank you for that. Right, Adrian, to move on to you. David's mentioned Malaysia already. Malaysia's been in the news a lot the past couple of years because of PPE and the whole COVID response and the number of items that are made in Malaysia. Would you like to give your own perspective on what you've heard so far and also this issue of repayment?
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Adrian and I run the North-South Initiative. It's been a very exciting past few years where as a social justice organization, we are now dabbling or putting one toe into the corporate sector to try to understand what's going on. And using our social justice framework, I think remediations help, but we need to remember that some of the crime of overcharging and extortions, human trafficking and smugglings are criminal in nature. So the question is, when we are reimbursing the workers through disbursements or whatever, aren't we not keeping the cycle of abuse to continue. So there's a big question of what does the supply chain do when you actually find criminal elements? Paying the worker is good. It's helpful, whether it's a big or small amount. But in terms of social justice, can we quantify or repay that years of suffering and abuse of a particular worker with a few dollars? My answer is no. And are we ready to take next steps in, of course, you have your checklist of what what makes up forced labor, but this list doesn't match with the local law, and that's why Malaysia continues to be very problematic. My second point is the complex nature of the supply chain. I know brands who may have no clue at all, and these are big names, of what's happening in the supply chain. It's almost like we are having this conversation that happened 20 years ago, it's repeating. So even the basic ABCs are not done. And now we are talking about complex algorithms and matrices of how we are going to repay the workers. I wish the world was that simple, but it's not. We have seen some really, even if the workers are repaid, it doesn't mean that they get the other aspects of justice or even basic common sense solidarity and support from the brands or even the companies where they are working. So for me, I'm actually very worried at where this is going. It's a good start, but like the other speaker said, it's not the one-off solution. And from our side, our perspective, we are constantly trying to empower the workers. It's always best that this process starts in the country of origin. By the time you come to Malaysia, you have already gone through layers and layers of recruiters, which we can't even trace. So, who's footing the bill is one thing, but whether it continues, keeps the cycle of oppression going is another. And where does this money flow from? An easy solution is, of course, let's pay it up before the Americans blocks us and the whole list of countries who are going to follow soon. But does this really change the discipline, the supply chain? And from my experience, I've seen it's not just the recruiters who are involved in these crimes, but also human resource managers, outsourcing companies. So where's the due diligence? The due diligence we have been talking all these years. I can't see it on the ground in Malaysia. And I appreciate third parties coming in to check whether the workers actually got justice. But I just think we're all not serious enough. There's a lot more work to do. So one of the suggestion is, if there's a crime that happens in your supply chain, are you guys willing to report it? There's a question of how much disruption it will bring to your supply chain. But if we don't normalize human rights and social justice, the cycles of abuse is going to continue for a long time. It's just, fortunately or unfortunately, the Malaysian government is so weak in its enforcement. The supply chains are so lucky. Some of the CEOs and owners are not in jail, and I'm telling you because I've tested the system. It's just the way things are, and I hope things will change. Yeah, I think we must also look at the issue of living wage. So, as a fundamental solution, where you give migrants an option not to get into this cycle. I know that's a topic for another panel, but in terms of workers' empowerment, we need to break out of this exploitative cycle. Yeah, thanks.
No, thank you, Adrian. Your words remind me of when I was in Myanmar last year talking to some of the women in the apparel sector, and some talked about when they were younger working in Malaysia as migrant workers. Now there are about 600,000 women working in apparel in Myanmar itself, but of course that's now under threat because of the coup and sanctions. And we can all worry that the small progress that was made in the country of origin to create some greater transparency around recruitment and the non-payment of fees, that will be lost as the women either don't leave at all or they'll be using corrupt methods to leave the country. So I really, that really brought it to life to me, talking to the women who'd actually spent time in Malaysia and the kind of experiences they'd had working in the apparel sector in Malaysia as migrant workers. But you mentioned briefly the US, the lack of strength of the Malaysian government. And you mentioned briefly the US government. We've had a question through the feed here around the US government's withhold release orders at the US border, which is a sort of relatively new development. We're familiar with the TIP report, so the Trafficking in Persons report, but there seems to be more political willingness in the US to seize imports. Do you have a view on whether that works as a mechanism from a governmental perspective?
I mean, there's some critique about how fair the Americans have been and whose supply chain they are cleaning. It will come back in a full circle to the Americans in their own supply chain and the recruiters that are involved. So, these are sticks, and I wish that we didn't have to depend on sticks before we reform our supply chain, because this conversation has been going on for 20 to 30 years. But if it has come to the level of using a stick, then it's most unfortunate. I do believe that Malaysian authorities and of course all the other countries that supply labor, third world countries, are not going to change because they know they are not at the receiving end of the stick. So till then, we'll still have to keep on searching and researching and experimenting on what solutions are the best. I can only share that for Malaysia, as the global spotlight continues to shine on almost every sector, we will sadly still have to rely on external pressure to fix the forced labor and trafficking in the industry. My advice to companies: please don't take advantage of that. I mean, we are watching. It's just unfortunate that we don't have enough resource to tackle this. ILO is here, IOM. We have been mentioning this again and again. We have a weak civil society, poor governance, the perfect recipe for forced labor and human trafficking. So giving remedy a worker a few $100 is really not going to change things.
Thank you. Right, let's bring everybody in now for a bit of a discussion. I think you all opened it up really well, and I think the goalposts are sort of neatly set. Adrian challenged whether the repayment of fees is really part of the long-term solution or not. So Rosie, there's one for you. But before I come to you, David, the same kind of question. But I'm intrigued, David, when your supplier in Malaysia, recruits new workers, right, in a year or two's time, what steps have you put in place to ensure that you're not going to have the same conversation with the other brand as to who's paying what? Or are you prepared to do that every couple of years to build into your whole system the repayment of fees? What is the medium-term steps you've taken?
Sure. No, and we definitely don't want to be building the repayment fee process as standard. As part of this exercise, there was an element of prevention. So we did have a series of sessions on the back of the detailed investigation with our supplier to look at the gaps within their recruitment processes and how they can tighten up the due diligence processes that they undertake. The case in this case in Malaysia, they were hiring workers through the one official labour provider within Malaysia, and the issues weren't necessarily at that level, but further downstream in the home country. So they have tightened up some of the processes there, i.e., the HR manager would go out to the home country to select the workers to try and tighten up the process. But since we did these prevention workshops, the supplier concerned has currently ceased the hiring in light of the current legal changes within Malaysia, but has ceased the hiring of any additional migrant workers from abroad. So yes, it's a mix of preventative workshops that we did, looking at the due diligence processes that they undertake, and the second piece, which we just fell into more recently, was a freeze in effect of hiring new migrant workers from abroad.
Thank you. Another question that's for you, I think, mainly here from Tara Dermott, is how common is it really for you to sit down, or a company like yours to sit down with another brand to share the problem vis-a-vis a shared supplier? I mean, I think it's a good example of building leverage, right? But how common, how rare is it to do what?
I think from Reckitt's perspective, we do it quite regularly on other topics. I think we're members of the CGF, we're members of AIM Progress, and we know our counterparts in these companies. So where we do share suppliers, we share a common challenge, we do have informal discussions and explore collaborative opportunities to tackle them. So yes, we do that quite common. I think with these more systemic issues, passport retention, recruitment fees, when we're talking about significant sums of money, yes, you need to work in collaboration with others to increase that leverage and to move things forward. Thank you.
Rosie, I mean, other than just responding to everything you've heard already, there's a question to you here from Arween Joyce asking, are there certain sectors that are more open to repayments than other, and what do you do, and which of those industry sectors are particularly resistant to what are the sticking points?
This very much plays into what Adrian was saying, actually. And Adrian, I completely agree. This is just one bit of the harm that migrant workers suffer, right? It's a bit that's easily monetized, and it's a bit that's systemic, so it applies across entire workforces. There's all of the other stuff, so, failure to pay wages, but also the bullying, the harassment, the sexual abuse, and all of the other stuff. And I want to make it very clear that repaying recruitment fees does not mean that there is no liability for remediation of any other aspect of forced labour. But it's a way of trying to package this, at least this bit up, and systematise it. No, your point is very well taken. I would agree that it's all about demand at the moment. At the moment, this is being driven by two major forces. One is the US CBP, either the actual or the threat of not being able to import product into the United States. And that is having a strong effect. So some of those sectors where that is relevant are moving more quickly. And there the issue is about the quality of that work, whether it is up to a standard that one would like to see. But certainly there's been a volte-face in attitude. So a year ago, having conversations with those business leaders, there was no way that most of them would consider doing a proper repayment. Now they're all doing it because it's becoming part of what they have to do for business. And they will make damn sure that when they recruit next time round, they have better oversight and stop up at least some of the holes, which there are in recruitment, because nobody wants to go to their board and ask, as Top Glove has had to do for $36 million to pay workers for this fee. So I think that those sectors which are under that scrutiny are moving more quickly. There are other sectors where customers are pushing hard. In our experience, and to your point on collaboration, David, when you have more than 50% of the customers by value of a place demanding this, it happens. It may happen slowly, it may not be elegant, it may not be perfect, but it happens. The ones which are very, very difficult are where there's no activist attention. And another example is Qatar, actually, where there has been some. There is a program in place that the Supreme Committee run on repayment. Again, it may not be perfect, but it is substantial, and tens of millions have been repaid. And that is largely driven by international opinion and activists and pressure. So all of those things help. The sectors which are most difficult to reach are the ones where the supply chain is unclear, where there is no formal supply chain, so informal workers, domestic sector, domestic service sector, where, of course, you've got very, very, very isolated individuals and invisible people, illegal people, irregular people, people who are employed via agents. It's far, far more difficult to establish a chain which leads to a clear case in those cases. And I think, actually, I mean, the ecosystem also needs legal challenge to all of this in order to impel us all forward to the point where this is the norm. Because, as I say, it's one of the things that can change the system. And it's one of the things which, because if repayment became the norm, there would be it probably would be the largest ever transfer of funds from richer people to poorer people over a short period of time, if all of those fees were going to be repaid. Now, that will have a seismic effect on government policy, on employer attitudes, on supply chain traceability, on enforcement, on investment decisions. And I think that is how I think that repayment plays a part in the change which Adrian so ably advocates. Does that help you?
That really does. And there's two more questions really that are for you here. Jorge is asking about particular geographies. Now, we've talked about, you mentioned the US, you mentioned Qatar, US as a receiver of goods, Qatar as a receiver of migrant workers. Are there other countries, other geographies where legislation seems to be tipping progress in the right direction? And also Jorge asks, how long on average do repayment cases take? Okay,
so I'll do the first one first. So legislation tipping things in the right direction. It will be very interesting to see what the European human rights due diligence law, how this affects that. Although, of course, remedy in that structure is not entirely clear. So I think that's something that we'll all be watching very carefully. I think customs, stopping goods at the border is the clearest market signal that there is, and that has achieved much more. I mean, I could give you lists of tens of thousands of workers who've benefited as a result of that law. I cannot give you lists of people who have had tangible benefit from modern slavery reporting legislation. So I think when we look at the laws in countries where in destination countries, I think those countries which are attempting to reduce kafala-like laws, so the laws which rigorously control and segregate migrant workers, those are the countries where progress is more easily made. And I'd be interested to hear what Adrian thinks about this. What's the second question? Just to remind me of the second question.
How long does it take on average? I mean,
now,
the repayment time.
How long does it take and how long should it take are two very, very different questions. So this is something which I've noticed a walking up in standards over the last 6 to 9 months. And this is very good because if you talk to workers, the positive effect of the repayment is diluted if it happens over a very, very long time, and it just gets frittered away as a little increment on the wage. It really needs to be done. I mean, I think our minimum standard in the published standard is now 6 months. I think it may even be 3 months. One of the things that I think would be very useful is to work with the finance sector, because obviously many companies don't necessarily have the cash flow to be able to do this immediately. And we think it would be very useful if banks offered loans to businesses who are repaying recruitment fees so that they could be repaid rapidly on negotiation, because at the moment it takes far too long. Negotiation can take a really long time. And then having done the negotiation, the repayment can be spread out over many months. I like to see it done 6 months or less.
Very good. Thank you. Very clear. Adrian, coming to you now. A couple of questions coming your way. One is your concern of fee repayments not being enough. Could that be partly addressed if brands and suppliers were also informing the Malaysian authorities at the same time? So there was some level of reporting and disclosure to the government. Do you think that would enable or strengthen political will in Malaysia to act if there was more disclosure to the government?
To be honest, without good governance from the very agency or body that is supposed to protect citizens and non-citizens. You can submit as many reports as you want. Without these reports being verified, I think the cycles are going to continue. But with that said, looking at how tragic the situation is in Malaysia, I think it's a good start. But you also need the check and balance mechanisms for that.
Yeah, Alex.
It's because it's easy to hide numbers through corruption. I didn't hear the word corruption coming out in the conversation today, and that's a whole big topic involving governments, brands, human resource managers, agents. It's not only the recruitment sector, but it's a whole ecosystem of crooks working to cause this. So we need social justice response. Thanks.
So Alex O has a question around hiring managers. I mean, you mentioned, David, that a lot of the bad stuff happens in country of origin, but clearly that is partly incentivized by stuff in the receiving country too, particularly the role of hiring managers. What kind of consequences, I mean, how would these standards around repayment and responsible recruitment, how can we better coordinate them so that hiring managers are actually feeling the consequences of corruption and the payment of fees? So Rosie wants to come in on that too, as does David, I think. But Adrian, for you first, what do you think should happen to hiring managers who are receiving backhanders?
I mean, if it's against the law, action should be taken. I mean, we have already identified some of these characters, and it's very shady. You even have entities which are not part of the company, but still managing the human resource in the company. It's shocking stuff. You guys need to come and have a chat with me personally, so I can reveal these things. But the human resource fraternity, part of the global supply chain, the big brands, you need to put a microscope on your human resource managers, especially those in Malaysia. Thanks.
Thank you. I think enough said on that. I mean, Rosie, you wanted to come in. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. We must remember that the real cost of recruitment is far lower than what many workers are paying, because many workers are paying essentially money that ends up in people's pockets along the way, and that's both at a high level and also at a petty level. I think one of the things that can be done in terms of corporate governance within employers is to make recruitment at a much higher level. So make signing off for recruitment at a much higher level. At the moment, it happens at a relatively low level, and it's something which is a nice little earner for many, many HR staff. One of the things that we've seen as being very effective is when the board comes to hear of this because they have to do a repayment, then you find that people are replaced, and also decision making for recruitment goes higher up the tree. And I absolutely agree that the same anti-corruption measures that have been successfully taken in many companies and places need to be applied in this area of recruitment. And it's something that we must not shy away from saying. So I know in many circles it's very difficult to talk about corruption. I think we should be very brave and we should talk about it. And we should all phone up Adrian and talk to him. There's also some excellent academic work has been done in the Gulf, which has actually monetized, Ray Giordini has monetized the corrupt flows. And it's really worth a read, because at the moment, the whole thing is completely the wrong way around from how it should be, with the wrong people paying and the wrong people benefiting.
So David, how do you deal with this corruption issue? Do you agree with what Rosie's saying? And surely then, if you're just repaying fees into a system that is inherently corrupt, that money's not going... I have to
stop you there. You're repaying fees directly into workers, not into a corrupt system. So the worker, poor fellow, has had to pay corruption. So we need to give the money back to workers and then stop the system.
Exactly.
Otherwise, workers are subsidising the corrupt system.
Because
yes, right or wrong.
I mean, how do you make sure that workers aren't operating under duress, right? And also that they're
that's very important. So the verification.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, the verification needs to ensure that workers are hanging on to the money. So that's why it's super important to keep contact with all workers who are being repaid to make sure that they hang on to the money and it doesn't get pinched by corrupt actors. But at the moment, workers are funding. The weakest person is funding the strongest person, and they're funding the corrupt scheme. And that's why it's super important that they should be repaid. But you have to think of that separately from, and the system must be changed.
Very clear. David.
Sorry to interrupt. I had to jump in.
Yeah, no. I think we're on the same page here. So it's about having a range of tools in place. There's a piece around repayment and the way in which we're doing that already in the supplier, directly into their bank accounts, quarterly reviews, grievance lines, ensures that workers get that money that they're due. And the second is then how we change the system. Part of that is having a far closer relationship with your suppliers. And in Reckitt's case, we've got our own people in the business, in market, who specialize within this space, that engage with the supplier to improve their standards and oversight. And then there's a wider advocacy piece around how do we change the wider industry here. And there was a piece around financing, as Rosie said. In a lot of cases, we're not paying recruitment fees back quick enough because of just cash flow. So how can the finance industry sort of support in order to grant access to finance? And is there a mechanism by which, if we have suppliers or individuals who are unwilling to change, where we can report the particular supplier concerned here? And that builds, John, on the earlier question you asked me, what do you do if the supplier or partner is just unwilling to do anything despite everything that you do? So,
what about the idea, I mean, both you and Rosie have mentioned the importance of the finance sector. What about creating bonds, for example, that suppliers need to pay into or legally obliged to pay to, so that money is in a way paid up front and is repaid to the suppliers on the basis that there are no fees? I mean, can you not tilt the balance the other way, or is that an uncompetitive proposition?
No, it's something we can consider. I think we just need the mechanisms in place, and that discussion with finance institutions need to happen to put that mechanism in place. Rosie, I think we've had this discussion before. Do you have something to add around this?
Yeah, I think the way that the bond system works currently is far too unwieldy. So you get contracts with bonds in, but recruiters basically don't ever get them because it takes too long and it's too cumbersome. So I think that the idea is very, very good, but that in fact there does now, David, I agree with you, we need to engage with the finance sector on loans to cover payment of recruitment fees, on some sort of bond system, but also on back-to-back financing. And those three together, I think, would help to change the system and help to, at last, try and incentivize any better actors who may be out there and give them a market. Because without that, we're stuck.
Thanks, Rosie. I'm going to go to Adrian now, and then we're going to do an audience poll. So I just want the audience to be ready. And we're going to ask you a question in a minute. So just be ready with your limber up your fingers for the audience poll. Adrian, have you been convinced by anything you've heard in the past 50 minutes around the importance of the fee repayment issue as part of the strategic solution?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the remedies which is the right of the worker. It's not that we choose or we create an option for them, but then the whole ecosystem of justice, you can never repay the migrant for the suffering they experience in the global supply chain. You get even $1 million, I can tell you, will not be enough. And I'm telling you from what I've seen on the ground, from every stage of the migration cycle till they go back, there's always someone extracting money from them. So my friends, if you think your 5,000 US giving back to the migrant is remediation, it is not. You are also, all of us together, are responsible for then creating that ecosystem for justice. And hopefully one day we will have, we can normalize the system to zero recruitment fee. Thanks.
Thank you, Adrian. Right, we should have a poll that appears on the screen now. We were debating what the question should be. We didn't want to make it as simple as, do you think migrants who've paid fees should have the fees repaid? Because I think 99% of people would agree with that proposition. So the question is, do you think repayment of recruitment fees to migrant workers by companies will ultimately help drive change in global recruitment practices? So it is that sort of longer term question. So if we could have that on screen now, it's not on ours, but I'm assuming it's on your screens as the viewers. Please go ahead and vote. Okay, well, this is quite interesting. In answer to the question, do you think repayment of recruitment fees to migrant workers by companies will ultimately help drive change in global recruitment practices? 14% of you think it's always part of the solution, the longer term solution. 27% think it's nearly always. 38% think sometimes. 8% think seldom, and 12% think it's unlikely. So it is skewed towards the positive, that it is an important part of the long-term solution, but it's not overwhelming. That for at least the 150 odd people that voted in this poll, it's not an overwhelming result. Rosie, does that worry you, what you've just seen there, or is that what you expected?
Yeah, I mean, let's also be honest here. It's very difficult and it's very unpleasant, and it seems very hard for companies who are trying to do this at the moment. So I think there's no reason why this hasn't happened before. It's because it's beyond the pay grade of most people working in this field, and it seems just too hard. We know that it is necessary but not sufficient for improving worker rights. It doesn't deliver decent work, heavens no. It doesn't even get people completely out of forced labour, but at least it recompenses them for a significant debt which they have incurred. I think that I'm not surprised of the people saying taking that middle ground there, because I think in my last slide there were 7 other factors that need to be taken into account. So it needs to be done well. It needs to be done transparently. So you need to see who's done it and who hasn't done it. It needs to be embedded into the forward-going recruitment market. And we've talked a little bit about the financial discussions that need to happen with financial institutions. I think all of those things need to be in place to get to the right answer. But no, I'm glad that the ayes have it largely.
And Rosie, I mean, as you said, this is the first time we've had a dedicated session on this issue at a global forum, and it's the 4th global forum. So, I mean, the minimum we can do is make sure that this is now a permanent part of the discussion, and the complexity of it, which we really haven't touched on in much in the past hour, we can get to some deeper analysis, I think, in discussions to come. David and then Adrian, I'm going to give you final reactions to the poll and also any thoughts about the way forward. David.
Perfect. I do believe the remedy of recruitment costs, recruitment fees, will drive change. The reason being, businesses are very good at identifying where cost is and how to strip it out. So once businesses start having to pay the vast sums of money required to reimburse workers, they will start looking at detail at the entire system and identifying what are the changes that need to happen. And I think the second sort of reflection, part of that is we need to have a bit of a shift here. There needs to be recognition is that hiring migrant workers is not free. You know, there is a cost. To date, that cost has been incurred by the workers and the migrants themselves, not the businesses. So I think the risk of reimbursement of fees and the sheer amounts of money that need to be repaid coupled with the recognition that businesses need to bring up to the surface the true cost of recruitment and bear that, I think will drive the change here, in addition to the other sort of tools that Rosie and Adrian have touched on.
Thank you. Adrian, final thoughts to you.
Yeah, I think the exercise will kickstart a change process, but it's still a market solution. I think some of the skeptics are also looking for a good governance solution coming from the authorities. So hopefully there can be a hybrid system with check and balance for this to happen in the long term. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Rosie. Thank you, David. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you to all of you who tuned in for this or who are watching it later. We didn't get to all the questions. As always, there was a flurry of really good questions at the end. We covered some of the questions, but we are happy to respond by email to others. And thank you to the panelists, and stay safe and see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.